Shall we make a start? Welcome, everyone. It's great looking at the attendees coming into the room and seeing some familiar names there. So thanks for your persistence in joining us for these webinars. It's really good to have you. And we also know from the webinars we've done already and from the range of people in the chat that we've got people who are absolutely new to this play and thinking about it or wondering why they've never heard of it or never seen it, and people who are vastly expert in it. And we're going to try and bridge that and have a conversation that all those groups of people and everyone else can find something to enjoy. My name's Emma Smith. I'm the general editor of the Oxford World's Classics Shakespeare, and it's really wonderful to have Harry McCarthy here to talk about his introduction to Titus Andronicus. Harry, hello.
Hello, Emma. It's lovely to be here.
So you'll know people who've been on this webinar before, they know already that in fact, the great pleasure of having the job of general editor has been to pick clever, interesting people to write introductions. And I picked you because of my admiration for your work across the board, but because I like the way you think about theatre, live theatre, and I like the work that you are doing right now about race making, racecraft, and those kinds of issues in early modern theatre. So they're things that I want to get onto. But how do you feel writing about Titus fits your career? Because you're not Shakespeare, Mr. Shakespeare, are you really?
I'm not Mr. Shakespeare. No, not certainly not a direct descendant because he doesn't have any. Titus was a play that I got very interested in as an undergraduate, and then sort of put to one side because even though it's now becoming increasingly popular and there's a production on at the RSC at the moment that we could maybe talk about, although I've not seen it yet. It's an increasingly popular play, but it's not one that is at the forefront of our consciousness when we think of Shakespeare. There are very few people who I think, some of them might be in the audience, but there are very few people who would think Titus Andronicus the first thing when they hear Shakespeare's name. But it completely revitalized my interest in Shakespeare when I was an undergraduate, and also really radically shifted my sense of what Shakespeare was like as a playwright. We tend to have a kind of fixed sense that he does these kinds of things quite well, and comedies end in marriage, so on, the tragic arc of the great tragedies. But Titus does not seem to fit in those brackets particularly well, because it's kind of all of those things. There is a marriage; it happens too early for it to go well. There are two marriages, in fact, but the tragic elements of it are or have often been seen as very farcical. It's a play that's been much maligned throughout its history, and I like championing the underdog. And this is a play which even now that it has a firm place in the canon, is often still marketed as an underdog. So those kind of aspects of it, that it's a bit of a black sheep of the Shakespearean family, have really interested me for a long time. And I think I've used the word black there probably quite knowingly, because this play also does very interesting things with racial difference, as those kinds of identity categories are beginning to take hold in early modern England. They're not fixed yet, and the play, I think, is in some ways implemented in that fixing of people into distinct social categories.
Brilliant. So it's early, isn't it? That's one of the things we always say about it. So I always think of Shakespeare doing mostly comedies and histories, then doing tragedies, then doing late plays, whatever they are. But in fact, this is a little cluster against that, isn't it? I suppose with Romeo and Juliet, early tragedy, early in the 1590s.
Yeah, yes, and you're hesitating there because we don't know when Shakespeare wrote it. There are endpoints and there are beginning points, and editors give it quite a generous bracket. It's early in that we know that it was written by 1594, which is when we have a first recorded performance. But editors have worked, and scholars have worked very, very hard to say it must have come much earlier, largely based on the fact that it kind of feels early.
Is that a euphemism for saying it feels not very good?
I think so. Yes, that. I mean, even earlier than scholars saying that, scholars were saying Shakespeare couldn't have written this because it's not very good. by a nebulous set of standards. And then when it became too difficult to prove that Shakespeare didn't write it, you know, when there was a kind of growing acceptance, largely based on the theatre and its sudden and seemingly surprising success in the theatre, people were much more willing to accept that it's Shakespeare on the condition that it must be an early play, while he's still finding his feet. And that's certainly not to say that he wrote it in the late stage of his career. He didn't, but it's not a kind of, I don't read it as a kind of apprentice piece. I think that there is a lot about it that is actually deceptively sophisticated. But again, I'm applying my own aesthetic standards there. So we can only really follow the evidence, which says that it was first performed in 1594, whenever it was written. But you're right that it is a bit of an outlier in the rest of the plays that Shakespeare was writing at that time. So that in itself, why he maybe was interested in pursuing it at all is a kind of interesting question, not one that I go into in any detail in the introduction, and perhaps not one that would be that revealing even if we did know the answer. But it does sit at a very interesting point in his career, not only as a playwright, but also as a poet, because it's the first of his plays to go into print, and it goes into print not with his name attached to it, but it follows hot on the heels of two ornately literary, but also deeply violent and sexual poems. So Shakespeare's clearly, that's Shakespeare's vibe in 1594, is, you know, deeply sexy, but also disturbingly violent. And perhaps it's something to do with turning 30. A lot of people do weird things when they turn 30. But that's where he seems to have been at. So that is also very interesting, I think.
Should we just outline, shall we outline what happens in it? So it's a Roman play, but, well, it's set in Rome, but it doesn't seem to be Roman. Is that true? I see that.
Yes.
I'm keeping an eye. Sorry, I should have said before. Actually, I'm so interested to have the conversation. I realize I've forgotten to say two really, really important things. I'm so sorry, Harry. One is put your questions as we go along in the Q&A, because if you put them all in at the end, we've worked out that we don't get to them. So if you've got a question as we go along, do that. And I can see that Jean from Kennebunkport, which is a place I've never heard of, Jean, in Maine, is asking about the sources, and that prompted me to think this is not a Roman play. But before you answer that, I remember that I forgot to say another thing, which is that this whole series of Shakespeare texts is built on the work of the new Oxford Shakespeare. Brilliant multi-volume scholarly enterprise led by Gary Taylor, John Jowett, Terry Boris, and Gabriel Egan. And in addition, for this play, Francis Connor and Anna Pruitt are part of the sort of team of behind this this book. So I would. Harry has written a brilliant introduction, which is what we're talking about, but I wouldn't want us to go without sort of mentioning that there's a lot of textual work behind that, which we have not ourselves directly done. Sorry, Harry. So that was, I'm just going back now to whether it's a Roman play. I think I've done everything that I'm supposed to do.
Yes. Where are the fire exits? Do we need to talk about that?
That's right. No fire drill is due today.
No,
So
marvelous,
make your way to
right. Yeah, so it's not a Roman play. Well, it is a Roman play, but it was often not thought of as a Roman play in those kind of wonderful mid-century scholarly monographs called Shakespeare's Roman Plays. Titus Andronicus wouldn't be featured, largely because to kind of preempt that question about sources, Shakespeare does not use his typical source for his Roman plays, which is Plutarch's Lives, a kind of compendious recounting of various Roman greats. He doesn't use that for Titus Andronicus, and there is not a discernible or a kind of identifiable slice of Roman history that Shakespeare is exploring. Normally he is exploring why was this ruler assassinated, or what happened after he was assassinated in the case of Julius Caesar, or what happens when a Roman sleeps with an Egyptian, as he is in the case of Antony and Cleopatra, something that actually happened. Titus Andronicus is not that. It's not a recounting of a particular few years. It actually compresses really a couple of centuries of what actually happened to the Roman Empire into the scope of two warring families. And it also draws immensely on Latin literature, you know, the kind of the classics. So it is a Roman play in that it's got a Roman feel, and productions often do set it in Rome. The word Rome is used more in this play than any other play by Shakespeare, including Julius Caesar. But it's not Roman in the sense it doesn't examine Roman politics. It almost seems to be as much about English politics in the 1590s, you know, what happens with succession. Succession is a very live debate. How do we accommodate racial others, religious others? Isn't it about time that we smoothed out these kind of tensions now that we all have to live together, etc.? Which is why it's proven and ongoingly proves so topical, seemingly topical. It's often marketed as a play for our time. The time in which Shakespeare wrote it was the 1590s. He's drawing on Rome, but it's not Roman history in the way that some of his other plays at least purport to be, even if they are actually more interested in examining something slightly more sideways. So yes, it's a Roman play, but it's also not a Roman play.
So we begin with two brothers who are the sons of the previous emperor,
yeah,
vying to be elected as emperor. In comes Titus Andronicus, the war general, and they ask him to become the emperor, but he doesn't want to.
Yes, and he brings back with him the bodies of 21 of his sons. He's an extraordinarily prolific progenitor, as well as a war general, but most of his sons die in war. And he backs the favoured candidate. So far, so Roman. It's about who's going to take over Rome. But in amongst this, Titus's daughter Lavinia has been promised to the other brother, seemingly without Titus's consent, although it's slightly nebulous. He tries to marry her off to the elected emperor, and that then goes awry. In the meantime, he's brought back with him the prisoners from the Goths, who he has conquered, including the Queen of the Goths and 3 of her sons, and he demands to slay the eldest son as a sacrifice. That's actually something that one of his sons demands has happened. And that then triggers this revenge tragedy, because it slips very quickly in the space of the first couple of 100 lines from being your kind of standard issue Roman play, who's going to be the emperor, to a revenge tragedy. But the aggrieved party initially is not the person that the play is named for, as in Hamlet. It is the Queen of the Goths, Tamora, whose son has been seemingly wrongfully killed in an act of what Romans and Goths declare to be barbaric, an act of barbarism. And then she vows to avenge this. Conveniently, she's also then chosen to be the bride of the emperor who has been chosen. He sort of looks at her and realizes she's actually more attractive. So Titus's daughter Lavinia does then marry her initial betrothed. And yes, so then it becomes a kind of Titus versus Tamora for the rest of the play, more or less. But what is very interesting is that you would initially take her side, because it does seem, as she says, her whole country has been conquered and she's been brought as a slave. Is that not really enough without losing your son as well? But to Titus and to the Romans, this seems logical, and it triggers a kind of tit for tat. What's quite interesting about this play is that it has often been seen as sensationalist and unnecessarily violent, and that is absolutely not to downplay the violence, which we will get to. But each of the acts of violence is in retribution for one of the previous ones. There's never an escalation, or well, maybe we can have a disagreement about that either with you, Emma, or in the Q&A. But there is never there's not then a mass slaughter that's triggered. It's often proportionate, as horrific as the acts themselves are. There's always a kind of clear mirror for why things happen.
Yes, and the mirroring that's really interesting. The mirroring is often sort of formulaic. I'm thinking about that biblical injunction about limited violence in revenge, an eye for an eye. I mean, we don't get an eye for an eye taken out in this play, but we do get a body part for a body part, don't we? There is a sort of awful, sick symmetry often about the tit for tat that you're describing. So it is a super violent play. There's lots of violence on stage. One of the things made me really especially look forward to this conversation, was one of your posts on social media, and you were copying. So the actor Simon Russell Beale is currently playing Titus in Stratford at the RSC. And the headline for his interview in the paper was, I can't get my head around all this violence. And Harry says, I can, come to this webinar. So let's call you on that. Why? Tell us, talk me through the violence and why it's there. What's it for?
I think the first reason is theatrical. Because this play now looks like an outlier in comparison to the average offering in London's West End or indeed at Stratford, and also against many of Shakespeare's other plays, although grotesque or really abhorrent violence is not something that he moves away from. And the most famous example of that is Gloucester's blinding in King Lear. And interestingly, in the same interview, Simon Russell Beale talks about Titus as a kind of proto King Lear. So Titus is deeply immersed in the theatrical culture of its time. And the early 1590s, the theatre is very interested in really pushing at the boundaries of what can be shown and what can be seen. And part of that is spectacular violence, whether or not that's has a kind of symbolic meaning. This is a period, of course, in which violence is much more part of the everyday. People are kind of almost inured to it in a way which perhaps we are now in our own culture without realizing it so much, that these kind of endless images of wars and genocides and so on, and you know, closer to home, sort of really horrific acts of violence, and also violence that we consume as entertainment. One of the most popular or notable productions of Titus in recent years came out at the real high point of Game of Thrones, and it was often compared to Game of Thrones in reviews. So one of the reasons for the violence being there, I think, is theatrical, in that it is daring the theatre to show something that is just unimaginable, and also to think through the implications of consuming that as entertainment, because everything that happens in Titus Andronicus, even though it isn't based on a particular narrative source, all of these acts of violence have happened before in literature, particularly in the classics. And not only does Shakespeare know that, not only does his audience know that, but the characters know it too, because when certain things happen in this play, characters immediately say, oh, that's just like what happens in Ovid's Metamorphoses. So there is a real sense of kind of overdoing or overtopping one's sources as well. So it's a kind of overtopping one's theatrical competitors in a very competitive marketplace, a theatrical marketplace, but also overtopping the literature that's come before and questioning why are we still doing this? Why are we still consuming this?
That's so interesting that the sort of tit for tat structure within the play is sort of a way of seeing its relation to texts around itself, you know, going one better or going one further than other plays and than Ovid. Yeah, I think it's the only Shakespeare play to bring its source onto the stage, isn't it? The little schoolboy has a copy of Ovid, and that's how Lavinia's treatment is finally revealed.
Mm.
So
We
it's
should probably say, but for those who haven't read the play, what Lavinia's treatment actually is, because I don't think I've actually said directly. But Lavinia, Titus's daughter, is raped by two brothers, two of the sons of the Queen of the Goths, as retribution for her eldest son being slain. And in order that she can't reveal the names of her assailants, they cut off her hands and cut out her tongue, so she can't speak, but she also can't write it down. Cutting off her hands goes one better
than
than
Philomel, because Philomel stitched, which always seemed sort of more effort than it needed to be. If she had her hand, she could have just written it, but she
yeah.
stitches, doesn't she?
She does. She stitches the names in a sampler, and it takes me an hour to sew a button back on, so I can't imagine how long. So it's kind of painstaking. And Lavinia's revelation comes when she, under the direction of her uncle, takes a stick in her mouth and guides it in the sand and writes the name. So again, but there you see a kind of sped up version of the kind of painstaking nature of sewing two names into a sampler. So that's what happens to Lavinia, and immediately the first person who discovers her, and indeed before it's happened, the attackers say they're going to draw inspiration from this story in Ovid, and immediately when her uncle finds her, he says, "Oh, it's just like this." And yet it still takes her having to write in the sand before anyone seems to really clock what has happened. So there is a kind of I think, a very gendered also commentary on reading and misreading the classics. And the classics are the backbone of humanist education in this period. They're what Shakespeare would have read at school. And it does seem that he's endlessly interested in whether or not that was a good thing and the things that you can do wrong with your source material.
Yeah, that's so striking. I mean, in my mind, it's a sort of version of "Can there be poetry after Auschwitz?" almost, or it, you know, is are we all being made better people by reading literature? And I suppose it makes me think that Titus is closer maybe to Marlowe's play Dr. Faustus, which is another play about the sort of underside of humanist learning, isn't it? That it rather than being the foundation of civilized society, it's got within it the complete dismantling of that. And yeah, what we seem to get in Titus from Ovid is not bottom with an ass's head forms of metamorphosis that we get in Midsummer Night's Dream, but something much crueler, yeah, and more negative. But do you think so is the violence in the play, as it were, telling us we are horrid, violent people? Is that its insight, or is it telling us? Is it a different version of that old question? You know, when you say what that old question about why does tragedy give pleasure, when the standard answers to that are something about sort of self-knowledge or coming to understanding or something, they're not usually we love seeing other people in pain, but is Titus giving us that answer?
I think again, it really depends on how that violence is theatrically mediated or filmically mediated. We should say there is a, to my mind, a brilliant cinematic adaptation of this play from 1999, I think, or 2000, which still stands, I think, as one of the best adaptations.
Yeah, so Julie Taymor's film with Anthony Hopkins
yes, hot on the heels as his turn as Hannibal Lecter. So there's some
yeah.
very interesting conversations being had there. So, again, thinking about sources, that film is very citational in the way that Titus also is. So I think the extent to which it gives pleasure can really depends on its handling in performance. Whether it says that we're all horrible, violent people, I'm not sure, but I do think it says that violence is always there as an option under extreme duress, which is perhaps, again, an uncomfortable thing to sit with. But one of the other things that I became interested in when I was writing this introduction was where it sits in the whole idea of revenge and revenge tragedy, and how that reads, how that lands to an Elizabethan audience. So one of the things that there may be some students here who are studying Hamlet. I remember when I was studying Hamlet at A level, we read a bit of Francis Bacon's essay of revenge, where he says, taking revenge, all we really got was one quotation from it, which says that personal revenge putteth the law out of office. So if you start taking revenge for something, there's no point in having a legal system. And we sort of took that as read as then, oh, okay, so then taking revenge is bad. But actually, if you examine the legal system in the 1590s and 1600s, it was absolutely dire. And people had no recourse to it, particularly not women who'd been raped, as is still the case. So where do you turn if you know that you can't trust in the establishment? And what we really see Titus go through, as well as losing one of his limbs and also nearly every member of his family, is he's given everything to this institution, Rome, for his entire life, including many, many, many of his sons, and believes so steadfastly in it that he's prepared to kill one of his sons for disobeying the emperor. And we see that happen really, really quickly at the very beginning of the play. As well as killing one of Timora's sons, he kills one of his own. And we see him endlessly, even when all of this has happened, continue to try to make appeals to people who are clearly rotten at the seat of power. And it's only then that he starts to fly off the handle. So he really has exhausted absolutely every other option. And I'm not saying that Shakespeare supports that as a solution, and nor do I, but the play is very interested in the question of where do you turn when there is nothing left for you.
Yes, and I suppose the implication of the villains or the criminals in this play, as in Hamlet, at the very heart of the legal establishment or the political establishment, means that Shakespeare's already established a situation for us where there is no recourse to law. That just isn't possible. So he's quite carefully forestalled that question, almost, that's what you should do. That's what you should do first. Yeah, that's really striking. Let's talk. Should we talk a little bit about Aaron and how he fits into this? So Aaron the Moor, um, lover of Tamora, and the sort of, for some people, the kind of hero, the hero of this play.
Yeah, he is a deeply charismatic character. He's on stage virtually from the beginning of the play. Depending on how the play is staged, you can often really go, I think it's about 500 lines before he speaks. And he only speaks once he's alone. So all of this goes on. He witnesses the sacrifice of the Goth brother, the parceling out of power, and so on. And then he sort of emerges and has a direct address. There's always a question over whether, if a character's on stage alone and talking, are they talking to themselves? Are they talking to the audience? Or is there some kind of intermediary? But anyway, he has a long speech on his own. And actors will often use that speech to draw, very Iago-like, draw the audience in, and kind of make them complicit. And he says, I'm going to, do a load of bad stuff, essentially. He's the first black character that Shakespeare writes. I'm using the word black because it seems very clear in this play that even though the word Moor has a very dense set of associations, it really can in this period function as a placeholder for non-white, non-Christian, non-European. Scholars of an earlier vintage tried to kind of refine that slightly to make Shakespeare seem, or to really kind of avert any question around Shakespeare's racism and so on. I'm not particularly interested in that question myself, but
they had a hierarchy, didn't they?
Yes. So
had their own hierarchy of races.
Exactly. Yeah. So there was there's a vintage of Othello's. Well, if Othello is Moroccan, then that's less blacks. That's more palatable, more tragic. That was the kind of thinking in the 19th century, particularly. But it seems quite clear from various things that are said about Aaron, and particularly that Aaron says about himself, that he is black. But he's not immediately the villain of the piece. As you say, he's kind of almost heroic, and indeed, even once he's triggered some villainous deeds, he has a heroic side. What's also very interesting is that initially none of the characters in the play seem to have a problem with him. They all believe what he says, and it's only after bad things start to happen that these racial epithets and slurs, essentially these racist slurs, start to pile up against him, to the extent that even Tamora, his lover, when they have a biracial baby, she orders for it to be murdered so that she won't be found out. He is kind of extremely protective of the baby in a way that can often be very touching in performance.
Particularly everybody else who is sort of, well, particularly Titus, I suppose, who, as you've already said, is quite cavalier with all these many dead children he has.
Yes, yeah, exactly. He's sort of the only good parent we see, possibly, or has the kind of makings of being a good parent. So he's very interesting, and I don't mention his humanity or his heroic side to kind of let Shakespeare off the hook of anything else that might be going on racially, because there are these slurs that are just kind of thrown around so casually that they're clearly at the forefront of Shakespeare's mind, or they're a very easy reach for him. But what is interesting is that the characters that we're supposed to feel sympathetic towards level these against Aaron even before he's actually done anything wrong, and that includes Lavinia. So when Lavinia can still speak, she's pretty racist towards Aaron in a way that's often elided in performance to really make her this kind of doll-like victim.
Yeah, innocence, that she's absolutely innocent, but she has a right go at Aaron and Tamora. Doesn't
Yeah, absolutely. And that is, of course, also not. I feel I have to caveat everything I say.
No, we're not saying that she deserves what she gets.
No, what she doesn't know.
But she's the more complex figure, actually, than the silently obedient woman who is then violently silenced.
Yes. Yeah. So Aaron is a very good case study, I think, in Shakespeare thinking through how racial categories are produced. That in this period they are not fixed. That there's a lot that appeals about Aaron as well. And there's also a lot that really does not appeal in this play about whiteness. And one of the most powerful speeches in the play comes from Aaron, where he takes the Goth brothers to task for basically dismantling their whiteness as being itself constructed. and what his baby reveals. And he has this kind of plot to swap his baby with a baby that's been born to one of his countrymen, so another black man who is white, and threatens to swap them. So he's really showing you actually really don't know. You can't ever know the race of anyone. And hey, let's slip this baby into the kind of the very heart of power in Rome and see what happens. So the play is very in tune with all of these questions around racial mixing, and also sort of makes a mockery of putting people into boxes as a means to dominate them.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it doesn't, I suppose there's a straightforwardly moral view of the play, which I don't think works at all really, but that says what goes wrong in Rome. I guess this is a sort of Roman play in that it is, I didn't know that statistic about it having more mentions of Rome than any other play, that it is sort of very much about a vision of Rome and what Rome is going to be like. But I suppose there used to be an account of this play which said what goes wrong in Rome is that these outsiders are brought into the heart and they sort of poison it from within, and all that stuff. Rome has become a wilderness of tigers and so on. But really, the play is not as straightforward about insiders and outsiders, is it? The deliverance comes from an army of Goths, so they are both, in one part of the play they're the problem, and in the other part they're the solution, and a kind of a more I suppose it's an interesting insight into Rome. I don't know that Shakespeare knows this, but Rome's own relative diversity. To be a Roman citizen was to be part of the empire, wasn't it? Which meant that, there were African Romans and there were Scottish Romans and
Absolutely, and it's also something that in the time that Shakespeare's writing Titus Andronicus, the English are really trying to reckon with their own racial pasts. That there is absolutely no there's no grounding in a kind of waspy sense of what it means to be English. That there are these kind of I talk about it a little bit in the introduction. There are all of these other racial groupings that form part of the fabric of English culture. So there is no kind of authentic. There never has been this kind of authentic English whiteness, and the play is exposing that through Rome. But it's also quite clear that it's making a comment on England, and not only about England being taken over by outsiders, although migration was really gaining traction in this period, kind of forced migration as well as voluntary migration. But it isn't responding to that as a kind of recent issue. It also does seem to be nodding at these kind of long time suppressed facets of English history, or suggestions around the origins of the English people, or the Britons, or whatever, which is absolutely not uniform.
Can I ask you about the authorship? Did that matter to you? So there's a now quite a strong but not complete consensus that this is a play partly written by George Peele, or perhaps the first act is written by George Peele rather than by Shakespeare. I mean, we don't completely know whether that's true. I mean, that would be on internal evidence rather than external evidence. And B, it might not matter anyway. And how do you feel about that?
I think maybe it feels like a cop-out, but I'm more interested in what the interest in authorship tells us about this play rather than who actually authored it. And by that I mean that I suppose my guiding principle in this introduction was that the thread that runs through responses to this play is that the play has always forced people to rethink something they thought or assumed about Shakespeare. In this case, was he a collaborative author? It was one of the kind of limit cases of Shakespeare writing in collaboration. People minded less. I think I've always minded less to accept that this play is collaborative because of those aesthetic standards to which Shakespeare's plays are often held. So if it is a bit messy, if it's a bit rough around the edges, then if we can kind of pass the buck to a collaborator, then that makes sense. The problem with that is that all of the stylometric tests that this play has been put under still attributes all of the horrible stuff to Shakespeare. As you say, the most compelling evidence is around the first act. So perhaps the first act was written by George Peele, and then he just said to Shakespeare, "Will you take it over?" Or he got bored, or that was always the plan. We don't know, and I don't know that we ever can know, because I think one of the issues with attribution studies is that those who work on it, and this is more about the field than the individuals involved, I think, but they bring their own preconceptions and their own prejudices to it. I think we do in all criticism.
Yep.
But it only really ever reveals what people think it will, or people want it to.
I think that's so interesting. I think that's such a great point, because I think one of the claims for Peele at the beginning of the play has been prompted by a sense of discontinuity about the character of Aaron. But you, just talking now and at more length in the introduction, you give a brilliant and a completely different explanation for that, which is about a category, an identity category, which is under some kind of pressure or under kind of formative pressures, and is expressing itself in inconsistent ways. Now, you don't need to also have two authors to say, well, one of them thinks this about Aaron and the other thinks that. You can critically, and you're using a critical armory, drawing from critical race, pre-modern critical race studies, and contributing to it, which just has a different set of different set of questions as well as a different set of answers. Yeah, you're right that attribution studies look as if they're scientific, but they tend to be the kind of science that reinforces exactly what you wanted to see.
Yes, yeah, and if we're looking for consistency in a Shakespearean character, I think we'll end up thinking all of Shakespeare's plays are collaborative.
That's right, exactly. It's funny when consistency matters and when it
yes. No one's ever proposed that someone else must have thought Hamlet was fat. Gertrude at the end,
or that Viola was a eunuch, so that must mean George Peele wrote the first act of Twelfth.
Yes, no, exactly.
Didn't bother to tell Shakespeare that she was a eunuch. Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, there are inconsistencies in the play. There does seem to be that the first act particularly does bear traces of second thoughts on one or both of the author's parts. But no, the question of attribution, I have to say, go back and do a lot more stylometric testing.
No.
I think it would make sense. Collaboration was the primary mode of writing a play in this period, so why not Titus Andronicus? I think if one were to look more closely stylistically than I have done, then discrepancies do present themselves between the first act and the rest. But the question of how does that make people think about Titus Andronicus was more interesting to me than who wrote Act 1, Scene 2, line 30.
Completely agree. And there's clearly, as we already just touched on, there's also clearly an interest in Marlovian style, if not Marlowe's own input. We're going to do one thing, Harry, before we move to some questions. So I've been asking everybody just to give us a little bit of a closer look at a speech or a particular moment, and you chose the moment when Marcus encounters the mutilated Lavinia and delivers this speech. So I'm just going to share a slide with that on. Am I going to share a slide with that on? Is that not there? Oh, I see. I've got more than I thought. Here we are.
I was worried we were going to have to do a line each and see how far we got from memory, Emma.
And that's right. There's always an answer, isn't there? So I'm just going to do slideshow from current slide. So here we are. Oh,
I apologize as well for choosing. Yeah, there we go.
There we go. Oh, there we go. So I've just given it from the book, because it's nice for people who are on the webinar to get a sense what the books look like, and to be reminded, I think, and reassured that they're not completely overwhelmed with more notes on the page than text, which I think can often just make you feel I'll never know enough to know about Shakespeare.
Mm.
So they're quite lightly annotated as here. But talk to me about this speech. I mean, for one thing, it's really, really long, isn't
Mm.
it? It's what, 45 lines or something.
Yes, yeah, I think 47, and
Yeah.
I had to, whenever I was writing the introduction, I would, if I was procrastinating, I'd go and count them again just to make sure that I got
Mm,
it. So I think it is 47, and you can see that in this particular edition it spans, it runs over 3 pages, and that is very, very unusual in this play,
mm,
where there is a real quick firing of dialogue very often. Long speeches are not common. So it's a real moment of pause. And of course, given what we've said about what has happened to Lavinia, it's completely unrealistic, because she would be dead within seconds of what happens to her, probably. So the entire thing is in some ways ludicrous.
mm,
And Marcus's response to Lavinia could not be more ludicrous, because what he does is aestheticizes Lavinia by using a kind of grab bag toolkit of rhetorical tropes, and compares her hands to branches, and her mouth, which is foaming with blood, to a bubbling fountain, and so on. So he's really, I suppose the poetical equivalent would be the blazon, which is a kind of itemized description of a woman's body. So you can see there immediately that those are two modes of speech which not only aestheticize but also contain and sever, I suppose, or dismember a woman into a series of constituent parts. The reason that I chose this speech to talk about is because it's one that has proved immensely difficult in the theatre.
mm.
It's nearly always cut. I think there is still, to my knowledge, one production. The current production may be the second. A production again at Stratford with Deborah Warner, directed by Deborah Warner, with Sonia Ritter as Lavinia and Brian Cox, not astronomy Brian Cox, Succession Brian Cox, as Titus. Kept every single word of the play, and that was really for the first time. But some productions, very famous productions, have cut the speech entirely because it seems unrealistic. But that to me seems to be the point. It's one of those pressure points that does what Emma and I have been talking about, which really puts pressure on this idea of reading, what you can learn by reading, the value of literature in times of crisis. Because this is absolutely, if you encountered a woman in this state, the last thing to do surely would be to reach for your copy of Ovid.
Mm.
But when it has been performed in full, it has been, as far as I can tell from reviews and so on, one of the things about working on this play is that there aren't that many landmark productions that have been performed when I've been alive. So there's one that kept the entire speech. There's only an archival recording and reviews and so on available. But it really broke the mold of making this moment about Marcus, and it really did make it a kind of two-hander. Lavinia's kind of very, very intense reactions, kind of making a mockery of this kind of response to a woman's pain. And it's not something that's been repeated with that great effect, I don't think, since in any production I've seen. Lucy Bailey's production at Shakespeare's Globe, which was mounted in, I think, 2006 initially, then revived in 2014, kept most of the speech. And the agony of watching it play out in real time is, I think, part of the point.
Yes.
And if you gloss over it, it diminishes the intensity, not only the intensity of Lavinia's suffering, but also the inadequacy of any linguistic response to something like that. And I think that that's something that we endlessly now. It's I would actually now, it's only just occurring, it's like a think piece. It's like when someone writes, what would Shakespeare make of, or what could Shakespeare teach us about? Insert geopolitical event to which Shakespeare has absolutely no bearing. It's drawing on a more limited and less humane range of resources than simply responding with humanity and empathy. So it's deeply uncomfortable viewing, as it should be.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That's really great, isn't it? So one thing I get from that is that a long speech does something with content, or has content, has referential content, but it also just takes up time, and it has a rhythm, or it intervenes in the movement of the play in a particular way. So it's a sort of moment of awful stasis, isn't it? Or the only movement in it is the movement of blood, or the movement of, so it has a rhythm. There's a rhythm to it. It's a great example of what you said at the beginning, about the way this play draws on Shakespeare the poet, because it's like a sort of set piece, isn't it? It's a really good example of early-ish Shakespeare, which always has a piece of punctuation at the end of the line.
Yes,
Uh,
yeah.
you
It's a
know,
very tidy,
yeah,
very
what
tidy speech, and
ironically, yeah,
brilliant. Yes, ironically, and I think that's part of the point, that from this moment on, all the other male characters in Lavinia's life try to make her fit their understanding, which is indeed what happened, and continues to happen in a different way to rape victims in this period. They had to prove that they had been raped by following a very kind of prescribed set of codes. They had to kind of look a certain way. The men in their life had to interpret them thus. And we see that happen with Lavinia, and she resists it. Or in the theatre, she has the potential to resist it, because, of course, what's so interesting and horrible about reading this play is that, in this speech particularly, on either of those second or third images, you wouldn't even know she was there.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
It's a hopeful stage direction in a way, isn't it? Exeunt together. Just looking at that at the end.
yes, yes.
By
So
the
that's been
new,
added.
yeah. So
Together is,
exeunt is the plural of exit. So it's clear that they do both exit. So the together is a little tiny work of, I hadn't noticed it until I just seen it there. Little tiny work of amelioration by the New Oxford editors.
yeah, and
Because
it's also interpretive, because do they exit together harmoniously? Because at the very
that's
end of
right.
that speech, he says to her, "Do not draw back." So
Not
she's
draw
still
back.
trying to get
Yeah.
away from him.
Yeah.
Um, so and the way that is staged, I think, is a real. You could watch that scene from any production, and you would kind of know how this production understands the kinds of things that we've been talking about in terms of violence, literary inheritance, and so on.
Yeah.
You only really need to watch
Realism versus, yeah, and it's a good little uh sort of teaching point, isn't it? That it's a pretty standard thing in all editions, although clearly the Oxford Wells Classics are the best, to put added stage directions in square brackets. So if they're in square brackets, they've been put by the editors, and as Harry is saying here, they are an act of interpretation. They're always, even if they are trying just to make something clear that the editors think is obvious. Um,
Mm.
Brilliant. Let's stop that there now, and we're at about 10 to the hour, so we've got about 25 minutes to have take some of these questions, and that may take us off in some different ways. I'm gonna ask about well, there's a Ume Mama, you've made a number of points in the Q&A, which are really brilliant. Thank you for participating so fully in that. If tomorrow a captured enemy queen responds to Roman violence with cruelty, does that make her any more monstrous than Titus, who started the cycle by killing her son?
Mm.
I was thinking about that uh, in relation actually to a book about the contemporary world, which pointed out to me that how contentious it is to say when a particular sequence of events began.
Yes.
And that is always partial and interpretive. Where
Mm.
you choose to start anything, whether it's Titus Andronicus or whether it's a geopolitical struggle, shapes what you think, who you think is the injured party, or whatever. And that
Yeah.
seemed to really capture that. Does it show that revenge is only called evil when it's done by a woman or an outsider? I don't know. Do you think Titus is monstrous in the play?
As a man, as a person, um, He wouldn't be in my dream.
He's not heroic, is he? He wouldn't.
No, I was about to say he wouldn't be in my dream dinner party, which is a horrendous thing to say about this play in particular, because he,
That's right.
it
I think his
culminates with
cooking
the
leaves good
worst,
to be desired. Yes,
yeah, the worst dinner party imaginable.
I think it's
Um,
right. Good. I think you would go vegetarian if you were.
you
I think
certainly would.
if you're invited to a meal by Titus Andronicus, dietary requirements,
Yes,
vegetarian.
known in advance. I do think that there's definitely a gendered aspect to Shakespeare's treatment of the violence that is meted out. I think that switch from sort of aggrieved mother to monster happens very, very quickly in Tamora. But as you say, the question of who started all of this actually predates the play in a way that we can't really know about, because we only hear about the Goths from Romans. It's very similar in that sense to Antony and Cleopatra. We only really get a Roman perspective. We don't hear other Egyptians talking about Cleopatra. So it's celebrated at the beginning of the play that Titus has brought the Goths to yoke in a way that implies perhaps that they are in some ways the aggressors, or they're a potential threat. And indeed they are then a threat to Rome, because they come and they dissolve Rome at the end of the play at the invitation of the Romans. So I do think that there is a kind of a gendered aspect to it. But Titus is actually pretty monstrous, not only to his victims, but also to his own family. The most famous example of that being that after he has been tricked into having his hand amputated, there's so much in this play that I kind of mention these casual acts of absolute atrocity, without any preamble, because they do happen. That I think one scholar worked out that sort of once every 100 lines, there's something terrible happens. After he's amputated his hand, he says to Lavinia, who has no hands herself, and has had her tongue cut out, "Carry my hand in your mouth." And that's how they exit the stage. Another really painful moment to watch in performance. So his way of dealing with things is kind of very solipsistic, doesn't really seem to think about the consequences of others. But I think that is partly because he is a product of his environment. He's a kind of war machine. That's what he's known as. And we see through him the effects that adhering sort of slavishly to inherited values actually has on yourself, but also the people around you. So it's difficult. I think on Shakespeare's birthday, an organisation posted, which Shakespearean character would you like to be stuck on a desert island with? I couldn't really think of one that I would want to spend ages with. I think they're all kind of flawed in that sense. But I do think that particularly in performance, Tamora's monstrosity is something that directors and performers are happier to explore than Titus is.
Yes, and that's a bit. It's interesting if you have National Treasure casting, which was the Royal Shakespeare Company. I mean, Simon Russell Beale is a brilliant, brilliant actor, but he's never an unmitigated bad guy, is he?
No.
That's not what he brings to these. So it's an interesting bit of casting. Brilliant. Let's keep going. Claire very, very kindly likes my jumper. Thank you, Claire. 35 years later, I've bought a Pringle jumper, which was the great desire of my school days. Let's think about, Josie asks about early audiences and the violence. Would you think early audiences were shocked by the play as modern audiences seem to be? And I thought I might put that actually with Richard's question, if I can go back to there, about violence overtopping violence in other plays. What plays are you thinking of? So I suppose that's just going back a bit to, would people have fainted at the theatre as they do, or as seems to be weirdly kind of vaunted in productions of this play? How many people faint?
It is, yes. The famous production at the Globe, 2006 and 2014, Lucy Bailey. The director said, Lucy Bailey said that she was disappointed if she got below a certain number of fainters in each production, and that's both of those productions date from a pre-trigger warning, and Titus is kind of central to kind of questions around Shakespearean trigger warnings, which perhaps we could talk about. That seems to come from an earlier point in. It seems a very dated thing to say, actually, now that I really want people to faint to be shocked by this. I don't know. One of the sadnesses about early modern theatre history is we don't get deputy stage manager reports or anything like that. What we do know is that this play was immensely popular in Shakespeare's own time. And whether audiences would have been shocked by the violence or kind of wanted to see it, or as I said earlier, were more inured to it because public executions were also a form of entertainment. You know, these are
bear baiting, all that stuff.
bear baiting, exactly. You know, gentlemen carried swords around. You know, you saw naked weapons on the street as a kind of fashion accessory. So it's very hard to think yourself into that. But we do know that the play was immensely popular. It was still being performed late enough, you know, in right towards the end of Shakespeare's life, because in 1614, so even conservatively 20 years after it was first performed, Ben Jonson refers to it as being, you know, if you still like that, you really need to get a grip and move with the time. So it's still in repertory. It's still known. It's in the list of plays that were staged in the indoor theatre, the Blackfriars, when Shakespeare's company took that over in 1609. That's probably or possibly why it was reprinted in 1611. So there seems to be an enduring appetite for Titus Andronicus right through Shakespeare's career. It's not seen. I saw someone else in the chat, Morris Atkinson, ask if it's an aberration in Shakespeare's career. Audiences and his acting company certainly didn't see it as a blip that needed to be shut away or forgotten about. It was enduringly popular.
Picks up Laurie's question too. It was one of the most requested for performance when he was alive. Is that true? I mean, again, we've got relatively little evidence about that, but there does, you know, as Harry said, it's definitely a play which persists in the repertory, doesn't it?
Yes, and was requested or was clearly thought to be requestable when it's performed in a private home in 1596. That's the last recorded production in Shakespeare's lifetime, but it's part of the New Year's entertainments in a stately home.
Okay.
Which,
is that when that French guy says it's all Monts?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So I mentioned that briefly in my introduction. Yeah. So it's patrons often did not request specific performances. They just said, you know, bring your best stuff. But it seems extraordinary to think that after a banquet, that would be what anyone, you know, you'd think this is really going to go off and sell.
Completely. And Richard's question about what we're thinking of, are we like Ben Jonson thinking of Spanish tragedy as the play to beat, I suppose, Tamburlaine?
Yes, yeah, Tamburlaine. I mean, the character of Tamburlaine. A lot of Marlowe's anti-heroes, stage villains. You can see a lot of them in Aaron. There is a school of there's not evidence, but it's possible that the same actor who played those roles, Edward Allen, may have played Aaron in an early performance. But again, I'm saying that is not proven. So there is that kind of stage charisma of the kind of so-called stage devil Shakespeare seems interested in adopting. The violence, I would say, yeah, the Spanish tragedy, which culminates in a kind of mass murder and the avenger or the revenger biting out his own tongue. So those kind of very iconographic moments of extreme violence seem to be something that Shakespeare's interested in staging. But they're as much the product of the classical plays that he's reading, even though none of that violence would actually have been shown on stage. So that there's maybe a question about, well, what if it is?
Yeah, interesting. There's a couple of questions about comedy that I wanted to ask you. So, Edel, thanks. It's good to see you, Edel. The scene where Lavinia carries her father's hand in her teeth sometimes prompts laughter, and a little bit further up. Sorry, I'm just going to. Someone asked about. Oh yeah, this is a brilliant, clearly a Russian bot called RDDX5. Anyway, I've seen Titus a few times in some productions. The audience have laughed at certain scenes. Any thoughts on this? Yeah. What kind of humor is there in the play?
No, and I too have laughed at it, because one of the humorous things about the play is how excessively it puns on the word hand when Titus and...
I thought that when you said this is a two-hander. I
Oh,
thought,
yes.
yeah,
Yes. Well,
should
yeah,
be four, but
it's
there's
sort of
only two.
impossible. It's impossible. So Titus says to Marcus, "Oh, handle not the theme to talk of hands," and he's sort of pointing at his, at his recently amputated hand and the fact that Lavinia doesn't have two. So there seems to be a kind of ridiculing of trying to put into words something that has happened. And its laughter is also featured in the play itself. It doesn't only prompt it, but Titus is tricked into amputating one of his own hands in exchange for his two sons' lives. But they actually say, "We'll spare the heads of your two sons," and then they bring him the severed heads of his two sons. And rather than say anything, he laughs. So the line is "ha ha ha," which sort of, to my mind, emphasizes how inadequate language is, or any kind of verbal response is, to such atrocity. And we know it's a bit like, wanting to laugh at a funeral or something like that. There is a kind of reflux, a kind of hysterical
Yeah,
reflux, often in the face of absurdity, excess of grief,
yeah.
that the play seems interested in exploring. But it also, in production, it can be hugely effective in keeping you guessing.
Mm.
So again, that production, the Deborah Warner production with Brian Cox, one of the things that Cox was really praised for was what made Titus so menacing is you just never knew, and the play itself is that audiences would be lured into laughing along, and then suddenly something absolutely appalling would happen.
Yes.
So it's a real kind of tightrope walk.
Yes, that's been the kind of Tarantino-y comparison, which was another quite popular comparison, wasn't it, in the sort of early 2000s, to
Yeah.
say this is about slick, stylish, perhaps slightly amoral representations
Mm.
of violence. Just for information, RDDX5 is not a Russian bot, Robert. I'm
Right.
sorry, I didn't mean to traduce you in that way. And had you been a Russian bot, it would have been rather reassuring to think that they were coming to Shakespeare webinars, I think. Edward, I think, can't think of any of Shakespeare's characters. Maybe he's thinking of going on the desert island. Shall we pick up Emma's question about trigger warnings?
Yeah.
What you think of the value of these? I thought that was a really, you're absolutely right. This is the number one play, sort of, isn't it, for thinking about that. And in fact, later in the series, we'll be talking to Ian Burrows, who has done the Comedy of Errors, and Ian's got a really fascinatingly interesting book, I think, on this, called Shakespeare for Snowflakes. Shakespeare for Snowflakes. The title's sort of ironic, but
Mm.
it's a really interesting book. Yeah. What do you think, Harry? What's your take?
I cite that book in the introduction because
Yeah.
I think it does a brilliant job of kind of cutting through some of the noise. What always has baffled me about the knee-jerk response to trigger warnings is this assumption that every student must, of course, already know what happens in Titus Andronicus, because that is all a trigger warning is it's actually quite an unhelpful term, and I now use the word content note, just to it is simply a description of what happens, so that those whom it might affect on a deeper level than one might assume go in forearmed. Forewarned is forearmed. So in my own practice, I simply sort of describe in brief detail, in this scene this happens, or this contains references to. So the notion that students would automatically have read all of Ovid's Metamorphoses and also know everything that happens in Titus Andronicus, to me is kind of nonsensical. Often the people who shout the loudest about trigger warnings were the same kind of people who wanted an advertisement to go up before episodes of The Crown to say that it wasn't real, lest it should affect any kind of, sensibility. So it's very interesting that we want people to be robust enough to encounter rape and mutilation. But if there's any suggestion that members of the royal family did something slightly illicit, they must have it explicitly said to them that please don't worry, this is not real. So they're a very vexed and political issue, but have been politicized not by the people who either practice these things or are directly affected by them, which is the students. So some kind of content advisory has always been in place, going back sort of early television, or whatever. I think that the word trigger has perhaps been unhelpfully applied, because a psychological trigger is unpredictable.
Mm.
You know, someone with trauma does not necessarily know the particular
Mm.
stresses.
Mm.
So, to my mind, they are simply a way of helping students, users, audience members to navigate in as fulsome a way as possible quite difficult things which they are interested in. I think what they're absolutely not is saying don't look at it. They're saying no, look at it, and this is going to happen.
Yeah.
And now you know it's going to happen, so hopefully you can experience it more fulsomely.
Yeah.
But Shakespeare, of course, has always been the kind of litmus, in the forefront of any kind of culture war, for want of a better term. There's something about Shakespeare or Shakespeare's position that means he needs protecting. And the irony with this play, which I go into a bit in the introduction, is that once he needed protecting from being accused of writing Titus Andronicus. And now there seems to be this assumption that everyone already knows what happens.
And since it's Shakespeare, so what? Yeah, this is literature.
Yes,
This is
yeah.
not.
So now it's untouchable. It used to be.
It's a brilliant way of seeing how confused these things are. Yeah, that's excellent. Edward's gone off on one on the desert island. He's going to go with Desdemona. So.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Good for you. Good for you, Edward.
No, fair enough.
And yeah, Anna's made an interesting point about trigger warnings or content warnings, and I suppose this comes along with the sense of whether people are going to faint or anything, that they become like a sort of brag or a boast. You know, this is how bad it is. They're not being used quite in good faith. That they're almost sensationalist. I think that's such a good point, Anna. I have thought that. I have thought that too. Claire's going to have dinner with Rosalind. I don't know if there was ever going to be dinner on this desert island, but
No.
that things are going up. Things are going up. Okay, Rosalind.
We'll have to get Todd Borlick back, who wrote the introduction to.
That's right. We had Todd was our first guest, so have a catch up with that as you like it. If you didn't catch that, Jocelyn's interesting point about the speech that we discussed from Marcus, a specific response to Lavinia being muted. In some ways, it keeps the momentum going and creates a particular tension in that moment between speech and silence. That's a lovely point. Owen has been thinking about disability and physical disabilities being evil, which he has had a chance to think about in Richard III. Is this something reflected within Titus Andronicus? I mean, I suppose what we do get is a lot of people who undergo bodily who step away from a sort of body normativity, let's put it that way. So there is a sort of, I mean, in some ways what you've been talking about, the Lavinia with the hand in her mouth, or those kinds of things. I mean, that enters into that territory, doesn't it, of how
yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. There isn't a sense of biological predestination or predetermination in the way that there is with Richard III, that I am, determined to prove a villain, that he's determined himself, but he was also kind of ordained to be villainous because of his disability. It is an interesting play in that the characters in the play are wonderfully inventive with how to circumvent particular disabilities. Not in a way that really thinks about the implications on the individual who has undergone physical mutilation. So, Lavinia doesn't take it upon herself, for instance, to carry Titus's hand, nor is she the one who comes up with the idea of putting the stick in her mouth to reveal the names of her rapists. There are other moments where Titus tries to force feed her, and she resists that. He says, if you want to kill yourself, then hold a knife in your mouth and stab yourself. So there is a kind of unthinking trying to sculpt her still to fit into a mold and make her useful. So it's a kind of form of, I mean, it's absolutely not an accommodation, but there are these kind of strategies for inclusion. And one of the things that was really important to me on the cover was that Lavinia would feature, because she does play a role. She plays an active role in the revenge. And that can in performance be played as her having kind of more agency than perhaps the text describes to her. So I don't think that disability in this play is associated with monstrosity. I think it's a hurdle to be overcome in the pursuit of other characters' motivations. Can one still be a useful accessory?
And Lavinia, yeah, Lavinia absolutely is that in the final scene, isn't she? There's a few of other questions. Sabine, you've asked about textual questions, quarto folio questions. I think that's too big for us to deal with in this bit of time. But if you want help with that, why don't you just ping me an email? You can find my email address if you ping me at Oxford, and I can send something to you on that. And obviously, we've said before, if anybody has a burning question that they didn't get answered and they want to follow up, please do. I'm happy to do that. Claire's got an interesting point about whether Titus's character is sufficiently established, really, before he begins a downward spiral. It feels as would his military history, she says, have carried more unambiguously heroic weight. And it is interesting, that opening scene, isn't it, coming in with the coffin of the son entering the family tomb. One strand of that opening scene is of family and national piety, isn't it? And of a sort of behavior, slightly Remembrance Day behavior.
Yes, yeah, it would be interesting to see a Titus staged at the cenotaph or something like that, because it does seem that he is a character who hews to the past, kind of capital P, and all we really, the only evidence we really see of his military prowess, is what we're told about him. So I think that point about him not really being a fully established character, or perhaps one that we can see enough of the before to really sympathise with him. I think perhaps that's maybe part of the point, that almost without exception, he is played as someone who really should not, by any kind of standards of a statutory retirement age, should not still be going off to war, or certainly not leading battles. In the Anthony Hopkins film, for instance, that's one of the real kind of hallmarks of his character. He just looks exhausted.
And that's one of the anticipations of Lear, isn't it? Which is interesting. Yeah.
So I think that is one of the questions the play is prompting us to ask, is that how much do we cling to those kind of values? If this guy was a war hero, and what does that even mean anyway, as we're discussing, who is the aggressor and who is the victim? That is never a straightforward question. If he's done all this great stuff, including slaying on stage the son of one of his war prisoners, that's the first thing we actually see him do. So yeah, it really is from the outset. He's a character that perhaps the play asks us to sympathise with later, and leaves open whether or not it's actually done enough for that to be possible.
Couple of points I want to just get in before we go. A lovely point from Stephen Watkins, thinking about Simon Russell Beale in Death of Stalin, Barrier, a performance taking violence to absurdist extremes, which might be the parallel between these two performances, just as Hannibal Lecter was the sort of
that's a lovely idea.
Someone has asked about the lamentable tragedy of Titus Andronicus. Are there elements in the play that are lamentable? I wonder if we've got a bit of a sort of historical false friend here, that lamentable to us means sort of weak, or sort of we rather wish it hadn't happened, or this is poor or something. Whereas I think this may not be the angle of your question at all, but I think that in the early modern period that probably means sorrowful things that prompt lamentation, and that lamentation in its biblical sense was a sort of powerful emotional response. I think it may be about a kind of a more emotional response. I think
so. And there is a ballad which we've not talked about, which seems to kind of stem partly from this play, which is called Titus Andronicus' Complaint. And you can actually type that in and listen to obviously not a recording from the 17th century, but you can listen to a modern singer singing it. It's really dirgy, as ballads often were. But yeah, that idea of kind of complaint, That first quarto title page that says the lamentable tragedy is one of my favorite, because I think the typography is so terrible. It sort of says the lamentable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's absolutely brilliant. It takes them a long time to realize that you might put the most important thing in the biggest letters. It's one of the great sort of, whenever you think about, I mean, it's a tiny version of what you were saying about aesthetic standards earlier,
Yeah.
you know, what seems completely naturalized to us. We've got hardly a minute to wind up. What would you suggest, Harry, if people, so people should get your edition and read your introduction to Titus Andronicus in the Oxford World Classics? Is there anything, is there another step you would encourage anybody who's been inspired by this conversation?
I think the best way to access this play properly is to see it, and that's a cliche about all of Shakespeare's plays. But the film, the Tamor film, which is simply called Titus, probably to bring it more into line with Hamlet, Coriolanus, Julius Caesar, so on. Othello is well worth checking out. It's very widely available. If anyone has access to the Globe player, the 2014 Lucy Bailey production was what got me interested in this play in the first place. There's a huge amount now that has been written on Titus. I suppose if I was to pick a couple of things, very accessible introduction to the questions of racial difference that we've been talking about in Farrah Karen Cooper's The Great White Bard, which came out a couple of years ago. And those interested in the sexual violence of the play and staging Lavinia, I think the best kind of performance reading is Pascal Abish's Shakespeare's Violated Bodies, which has stood the test of time. It's over 20 years old, but it's an oldie but a goodie.
It's an absolute oldie but a goodie. I was thinking about Pascal when I was in the Swan Theatre watching Simon Russell Beale just this week. I think that's all we've got time for. I've really enjoyed the conversation today. Thank you so much, Harry. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. I'm really sorry if we didn't get to them, but I hope you'll agree with me that it's been a really wide-ranging and fascinating conversation. Thanks, Harry.
Thank you very much.